The story of Marco Polo begins not with an extraordinary journey, but in a humble yet vibrant city, Venice, a place where the shimmering waters of the Adriatic met the grand architecture of Europe. Venice in the 13th century was a melting pot of cultures, where east met west across the vast Mediterranean. Marco was born in 1254, likely in a house overlooking the canals of Venice. It was a time of great prosperity for the city, which was known as one of the most powerful maritime republics in Europe. The streets were alive with merchants from all over the world, and Venetian ships sailed to distant lands, bringing treasures from the far reaches of the globe. Venice was a city of contrasts, beautiful, cosmopolitan, and yet filled with the daily hum of hard work. Marco's family, like many others in Venice, was deeply connected to this world of trade. His father, Niccolo Polo, and his uncle, Mafio Polo, were successful merchants who had already established themselves as prominent figures in the city's merchant guilds. But while Venice was known for its wealth and trading power, it was also a city brimming with curiosity, a place where maps were studied and new stories were eagerly shared by travelers. For Marco, growing up in such a city meant exposure to a life of exploration and adventure from an early age. His family's trade routes stretched far beyond the familiar borders of Italy, and it was in these voyages that Marco would one day find his path. Marco's father, Niccolo, was an ambitious and adventurous man, deeply involved in the world of Venetian trade. The Polo family business was focused on the import and export of goods, precious textiles, spices, silks, and other exotic materials. As the young son of a prominent merchant, Marco was born into a world that was already stretching its limits, both geographically and culturally. But what makes Marco's early life so intriguing is the close bond he shared with his father and uncle. As a child, Marco had grown up listening to their tales, stories of distant lands, strange customs, and foreign peoples. These stories, shared around the family table or in the quiet evenings by the canal, were more than just business accounts. They were windows into a world unknown, one that would ignite a spark in the young Marco Polo, a desire to see the world for himself. It was through these stories that Marco learned of the wonders of the East. His father and uncle had already traveled beyond the Mediterranean. They had crossed into Asia, where they encountered unfamiliar landscapes, encountered different peoples, and witnessed cultures unlike anything known in Europe. While Marco was still a boy, the Polo family's journeys began to take them further than most Venetians would ever go. Marco was educated in the ways of Venetian commerce, learning about navigation, trade, and the various cultures of the Mediterranean. But the education Marco received was not limited to the classroom. He was, in a sense, being prepared for something greater. A boy born into a family of travelers, he was being molded to continue the legacy of his forebears. The lessons of Venetian merchants were practical, but Marco's curiosity was also piqued by the tales of far-off places, which he absorbed with almost childlike wonder. His imagination was stirred by the idea of the great Mongol Empire, by descriptions of the court of the legendary Kublai Khan, and the fabled riches of China. For young Marco, these stories were not simply entertainment. They were invitations. Invitations to a world beyond the narrow canals of Venice, to an adventure that, as he would later learn, would change his life forever. In the year 1260, when Marco was just 6 years old, his father and uncle embarked on a journey that would take them far beyond their familiar Venetian shores. The Polo family set their sights on the east, drawn by the stories of the legendary Mongol Empire. where the great Kublai Khan ruled over vast lands stretching from China to Persia. Their first trip, which would take them to places like Constantinople and beyond, was not a quick jaunt. It would span years, and it was filled with hardship, danger, and the constant uncertainty of travel at the time. By the time Marco was old enough to understand the significance of these journeys, his father and uncle had already set the stage for his eventual participation in the greatest adventure of his life. At the age of 17, Marco was about to take his first steps into a world that would stretch far beyond his wildest dreams. In 1271, after years of successful trade missions, Marco's father and uncle returned to Venice after a lengthy absence. They had been in the service of Kublai Khan, the grandson of the great Genghis Khan, and had been invited to return to the Mongol court. Marco, now a young man, was eager to join his father and uncle. This was not just a family decision. It was a fulfillment of a lifelong dream. The Polo family would embark on a journey across the known world, a journey that would take them across deserts, through cities, and into the heart of the Mongol Empire itself. And with it, Marco would begin a voyage that would make him one of the most famous travelers in history. But before Marco Polo set sail, he was at heart a Venetian boy, a child of the canals, the marketplaces, and the streets that were filled with the hum of life. It was here, in Venice, that his curiosity was first kindled. It was here that he learned the value of travel, of seeing the world, and of seeking new experiences. And it was here that the seed of exploration was planted in his young mind, a seed that would grow to shape not only his destiny, but the very course of history. From the streets of Venice to the distant courts of Kublai Khan, Marco Polo's early life was filled with the promise of something extraordinary. But the true adventure was just beginning, and the lessons he learned in his childhood would prepare him for the vast unknowns he would soon encounter. In the summer of 1271, Marco Polo, at the age of 17, set out on a journey that would alter the course of his life. With his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo, Marco embarked on a voyage that would take him from familiar shores of Venice to the distant lands of the East. Their departure was not marked by fanfare or excitement, but by the quiet determination of a family of merchants who knew the importance of the road ahead. For Marco, it was the beginning of an adventure that would unfold over the next 2 decades, one that would take him across deserts, mountains, and through lands unknown. As they left the safety of Venice behind, Marco's heart must have been filled with both wonder and uncertainty. He had grown up hearing stories of the distant East, but now he was about to experience it for himself, not as a young listener to tales, but as an active participant in the great journey. The road was long, and the journey was far from easy. The Polo family first made their way through the Mediterranean, traveling across the seas to Constantinople, then on to Asia Minor. The journey was not a swift one, but rather one marked by slow, steady progress. Along the way, Marco would have encountered the harsh realities of travel in the medieval world. Long days under the hot sun, uncertain weather, and the fatigue of crossing unfamiliar territories. The route was not just a physical journey, but a cultural one as well. Marco, now in his late teens, would have seen the world in ways he never had before. The bustling markets of Constantinople, where merchants from across the known world traded goods, would have fascinated him. The city, known for its strategic location at the crossroads of East and West, was a place where cultures collided, and Marco would have begun to understand just how vast the world truly was. From Constantinople, the Polos continued their travels, moving further eastward. As they crossed the desert of Persia and into Central Asia, Marco would have encountered not only new landscapes, but new customs, new languages, and new ways of life, each more foreign than the last. The journey through Persia was particularly challenging. The vast desert landscape stretched endlessly, offering little respite from the harsh sun and intense heat. For months, Marco and his family traveled across these arid expanses, often following the ancient Silk Road, which connected the cultures of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. This was a world entirely different from the one Marco had known. The dusty paths of Central Asia, dotted with caravanserais, large, fortified inns, became temporary sanctuaries where travelers could rest, trade, and gather before continuing their journey. These desert outposts were critical to the success of the Silk Road, and Marco would have witnessed firsthand the importance of trade in sustaining such a vast network of routes. The Polo family also passed through the ancient cities of the Persian Empire, where Marco would have encountered new religions, unfamiliar foods, and strange customs. As a Venetian, Marco had grown up surrounded by Christianity, but now he saw the influence of Islam and Buddhism, which would have been strikingly different from his own beliefs. Despite the challenges, there were moments of beauty along the way. Oasis towns, with their lush gardens and cool waters, offered a welcome relief from the harsh desert heat. These oases, with their palm trees and quiet, shaded paths, were places of rest and reflection, offering a momentary peace before the next leg of the journey. As they moved further east, through what is now modern-day Iran and Central Asia, Marco had been increasingly aware of the complex and diverse cultures that inhabited this part of the world. These regions were steeped in history, their cities filled with ancient architecture, markets full of spices, textiles, and silks, luxuries that Marco had only heard about in the stories of travelers. But beyond the sensory wonders of these places lay the stark realities of a world still struggling with political instability and the legacy of war. The Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Genghis Khan's descendants, was a force of nature, expanding rapidly across Asia and reshaping the political landscape. Marco's family, with their trade connections, would eventually find themselves caught up in the momentum of this vast empire. By the time the Polo family crossed the Persian plateau and entered Central Asia, the Mongols had established themselves as the dominant force in the region. The Mongol Empire was not merely a collection of lands. It was a complex, multifaceted empire with a powerful and visionary ruler at its helm, Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan, the grandson of the great Genghis Khan, had already begun to shape China into a formidable and prosperous empire. Marco would later recall that the Mongols were not just fierce warriors, but also keen administrators, with a sophisticated system of governance that included the promotion of trade, the protection of travelers, and the building of infrastructure to link distant regions together. Despite the daunting challenge of navigating through such a vast empire, Marco's family pressed on. They were not just merchants now. They were travelers, adventurers, and in some ways, ambassadors of Venice. They were learning how to survive in a world far beyond the familiar shores of Europe, in a world that was both awe-inspiring and daunting. Finally, after years of arduous travel, Marco and his family arrived at the gates of the Mongol Empire. Their destination was Xanadu, a grand city in the Mongol heartland, where Kublai Khan held court. Marco, who had spent most of his youth in the relatively small and contained world of Venice, was now entering a world that seemed vast beyond measure. Kublai Khan's court, which Marco would come to know intimately, was a place of both sophistication and power. It was a world of luxury and military might, of cultures meeting and melding in ways that Marco could scarcely have imagined. For the Polo family, this was the culmination of years of travel, and for Marco, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would shape not only his life but the future of exploration itself. Marco himself had this to say about it. The city of Xanadu, the residence of the great Khan, is beyond what I could ever have imagined. It is filled with men of every race and nation, all working in the service of the Khan. The riches here are unparalleled, the markets brimming with goods from across the world. I find myself in awe of the empire's vastness. The journey to the east had tested Marco Polo in ways that few could have imagined. The hardships of travel, the unfamiliar cultures, the vast and sometimes unforgiving landscapes. All these challenges were shaping him into a different kind of person. But more than that, they were preparing him for a role he could never have predicted. As the Polo family entered the Mongol Empire, they were no longer simply merchants. They were, in many ways, ambassadors of Europe, carrying with them the stories and wonders of a world that few could even fathom. And Marco, with his keen eye and sharp mind, was about to see and experience the East in a way that no European had before. Kublai Khan was a man of vision and ambition. Unlike the nomadic warriors of his ancestors, Kublai sought to build a lasting, sophisticated empire, blending Mongol traditions with the cultures of the lands he had conquered. Marco Polo and his family had arrived at a moment of great opportunity. Kublai was eager to form alliances with foreigners and saw the Polos as potential allies. In the travels of Marco Polo, Marco describes his first encounter with Kublai Khan as nothing short of awe-inspiring. The grandeur of the Khan's court, the wealth on display, and the diversity of those present all left a lasting impression on the young Venetian. With time, Marco's relationship with the Khan grew stronger. He was not just a foreign merchant anymore. He was a trusted member of the Mongol court. Kublai Khan, impressed by the Polos' knowledge and the stories they brought from distant lands, took particular interest in Marco. He assigned him to various administrative roles within his empire, tasks that would place Marco in a unique position to observe and influence the workings of one of the most powerful empires in the world. One of Marco's primary roles was to oversee and manage various infrastructure projects in the Mongol Empire. The Khans sought to improve trade routes, build roads and bridges, and establish better communication across his vast domain. Marco, with his experience as a merchant and traveler, was well suited for this task. His keen mind and eye for detail made him an indispensable asset to the Khan. Marco had this to say about the Khan. I have seen the roads of the empire stretch from one end to the other, built with care and patience. The travelers who once feared the distance now know that they are safe on the path. The Khan has made the world smaller, more connected. The empire grows not just by conquest, but through the bonds it forms. Interestingly enough, many today could say the same about Marco's influence on travel and trade throughout the world as well. As he continued his service to the Khan, Marco became more than just an administrator. He became a bridge between cultures. At the Mongol court, he had the opportunity to meet and converse with scholars, diplomats, and traders from all corners of the known world. The exchange of knowledge was a constant theme in Marco's life, and his curiosity about the world only deepened with each passing day. Marco learned about the advanced technologies and practices of the Chinese, the sophisticated governance of the Mongols, and the diverse customs of the many peoples living under Kublai Khan's rule. In turn, he shared stories of Europe and his observations about the world beyond the empire's borders would later fascinate readers across the centuries. Marco would write, "In this court, I have met men from places as distant as Syria, India, and even the land of the Franks. I listen to their tales and marvel at the wonders they speak of. The world is far greater than I had ever imagined, and yet I find myself at the center of it all, a witness to the flow of history." This quote illustrates Marco's sense of awe at the vastness of the world and the incredible diversity he encountered in the Mongol Empire. His position allowed him to engage with a wide variety of cultures and peoples, enriching his understanding of the world. As Marco's influence at the Mongol court grew, so did his relationship with Kublai Khan. The Khan valued Marco not only for his administrative talents, but also for his perspective as a foreigner. Marco's account of the world beyond the Mongol Empire fascinated Kublai, and the two often engaged in long conversations about the nature of empire, trade, and the future. The great Khan speaks of a world united, of an empire where no man is an outsider. He dreams of a time when all people, from the most distant corners of the earth, will be bound together by the ties of commerce and knowledge. And I, who once traveled to see the world, now find myself within it, serving at the heart of a vision that stretches beyond anything I had imagined. In this reflection, Marco conveys his understanding of Kublai Khan's ambition, an ambition that sought to unite the world through peace, trade, and knowledge. It's a vision that Marco, now deeply embedded in the Mongol Empire, can see unfolding around him. Marco's role at the Mongol court was ever evolving. He witnessed the grand celebrations and festivals that marked the Khan's reign, as well as the quiet, meticulous work of administering an empire that spanned across continents. Through his eyes, we gain a unique perspective on the inner workings of one of history's most powerful empires. And yet, despite his newfound status and influence, Marco never lost his sense of wonder. He continued to marvel at the many wonders of the Mongol Empire, the advancements in technology, the strange and marvelous creatures, and the diversity of cultures. The world, as he saw it, was still full of mysteries to uncover. Marco Polo's life at the Mongol court was one of discovery, both of the world and of himself. He had come to the East as a young Venetian merchant, and he now found himself at the center of an empire that would shape his destiny. His service to Kublai Khan would set the stage for the next phase of his journey, as he would soon become the Khan's most trusted emissary, traveling far and wide on missions that would bring him into contact with even more distant lands. But for now, Marco Polo was living the dream of many men, to be at the heart of a world-altering empire, serving a ruler whose ambition stretched far beyond the horizon. By the mid-1280s, Marco Polo had been in the service of Kublai Khan for nearly a decade. His role had grown far beyond that of a simple advisor or overseer. The Khan had come to trust him deeply, and soon Marco found himself sent on diplomatic missions far beyond the court of Xanadu. Kublai Khan's empire, vast as it was, needed to maintain ties with distant territories, and sometimes required a trusted envoy to travel across the realm. Marco, with his deep understanding of the diverse peoples within the empire and his fluency in many languages, was the perfect candidate for these missions. Marco's journeys took him far beyond the walls of Xanadu, across the wind-swept steppe, and into regions that most Europeans had never even heard of. His first major diplomatic mission took him to the distant reaches of the empire, to the court of the Mongol Khans in Central Asia, and even further into the lands of the Chinese heartland. These long trips, often requiring Marco to travel hundreds or even thousands of miles, gave him a unique perspective on the Mongol Empire's vastness. His travels were not just about exploration, but also about strengthening the bonds between the Mongols and the neighboring kingdoms. On one such mission, Marco traveled south to the heart of China, where the power of the Mongol Empire had become entrenched. His task was diplomatic, to establish and strengthen ties between Kublai Khan's court and the kingdoms of the southern regions. As Marco journeyed deeper into China, he marveled at the advanced infrastructure, the grand canals, the sophisticated markets, and the breathtaking architecture. The contrast between the Mongol-controlled north and the more established Chinese cities in the south was stark. Yet, Marco could see how Kublai Khan's vision of unity was slowly taking shape. I have seen many great works in my travels, but none so impressive as the Grand Canal. It stretches from the north to the south, a lifeline for the empire. I have witnessed the ease with which goods are moved, and I marvel at the skill of the workers who make this possible. Truly, the empire is a marvel to behold. Marco Polo's account of the Grand Canal highlights the monumental engineering feats of the Mongol Empire, and his role in witnessing and reporting on these achievements is a testament to profound changes he observed in the world around him. During his time in southern China, Marco Polo's role expanded beyond that of an envoy. He was often sent to oversee important administrative tasks, managing tax collection, supervising trade, and resolving disputes between the Mongol rulers and the local Chinese population. Marco's keen sense of diplomacy and his deep understanding of different cultures made him an ideal intermediary in these complex negotiations. As an envoy, Marco was also tasked with traveling to the more remote corners of the Mongol Empire. These expeditions took him to lands where the Mongol influence was still growing and where local customs were vastly different from those he had encountered in the more established cities of China. In his travels, Marco Polo witnessed the extraordinary variety of life within the empire, both human and animal, from the dense jungles of Southeast Asia to the snowy mountain passes of Tibet. Marco's journeys brought him into contact with lands and creatures few Europeans had ever imagined. I have seen wonders in these lands: elephants in the forests, tigers in the hills, and birds of every color. The lands are rich with life and mystery. I have learned that every place is unique, and no man can ever truly know all there is to know the world. But I have traveled far, and I have learned much. Marco's reflections reveal the growing sense of awe he experienced during his travels. Despite the hardships, his curiosity and desire to learn never waned. He was living in a world far different from the one he had known in Venice, and yet his travels only deepened his understanding of the vast, interconnected world. The diplomatic missions Marco undertook were not only about maintaining peace and alliances, they were also about the flow of trade and the exchange of knowledge. Under Kublai Khan, the Mongol Empire facilitated an unprecedented exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. Marco Polo was there, witnessing the full impact of this vast trade network. From the silks and spices of the East to the furs and precious metals of the West, the Empire's trade routes connected the world like never before. Marco, as an envoy of the Khan, was not just observing this exchange, but actively participating in it, learning firsthand how global trade could shape the future of nations. Through his diplomatic missions, Marco Polo became more than just a traveler. He became an essential figure in the Mongol Empire's administration. His travels were not only about exploration. They were about understanding the intricate web of relationships that held the empire together. Marco Polo's service to Kublai Khan was marked by his ability to bridge cultures, navigate the complexities of politics, and understand the vast landscape of the Mongol world. It was during this period that Marco truly came to embody the role of a global traveler, a man who had seen the world and understood its vastness, its intricacies, and its boundless potential. As Marco Polo's service to Kublai Khan deepened, so too did the scope of his journeys. He was no longer just an observer of the Mongol world. He had become a crucial player in the empire's far-reaching ambitions. From his central position in Xanadu, Marco was sent on increasingly ambitious missions, often traveling to distant and scarcely known lands. These were not just trips of diplomacy or administration. They were journeys into the unknown. At the heart of the Mongol Empire's power, Marco Polo began to see himself as a part of a much grander narrative. He wasn't simply carrying messages or overseeing construction projects. He was charting paths across the world, forging alliances in lands many Europeans had never imagined. One of Marco's missions took him to the ancient city of Xi'an, an important cultural and trade center in the Mongol-controlled territories. As he traveled through this vibrant city, Marco could see the power of the Silk Road firsthand. The flow of goods, ideas, and people from the farthest reaches of the empire. Xi'an was not only a gateway to the east, but also a symbol of the interconnected world that Kublai Khan had envisioned, a world where east and west could meet, trade, and share knowledge. In the market stalls of Xi'an, Marco Polo was able to witness the incredible wealth and diversity of the empire. Goods from the most distant parts of Asia were traded alongside European luxuries, showcasing the vastness of the Mongol trade networks. Marco himself was frequently involved in overseeing these exchanges, ensuring that both merchants and rulers were satisfied with the flow of goods. Marco's diplomatic missions took him far beyond his initial duties. He was soon traveling not just within the Mongol Empire's borders, but to far-flung places on periphery, regions like Tibet, Southeast Asia, and even parts of India and Persia. These were lands of their own unique cultures, and Marco's interactions with their people would forever shape his understanding of the world. One of Marco's most fascinating missions took him to the land of Tibet, a place that, for many Europeans, was a land shrouded in mystery and legend. The mountains of Tibet stood as both a physical and symbolic barrier between the known world and the unknown. Marco Polo was tasked with maintaining Mongol influence over the region, and during his travels, he would have encountered Tibet's unique culture and religious practices. He describes the Buddhist monasteries he visited and the spiritual reverence the Tibetans had for their mountain landscapes. The Tibetans are a people of great faith, and their monks are men of quiet wisdom. I have seen them in their monasteries, where the incense rises and the chants echo in the stillness of the mountains. It is a land of peace and reverence, and I have learned much from the men who live here. This reflection from Marco Polo highlights his encounters with Buddhist practices and the spiritual atmosphere that pervaded Tibet. These interactions allowed Marco to see the world in new ways, experiencing not only different cultures but different worldviews. Beyond the mountains, Marco's travels took him into Southeast Asia, a region of tropical islands and bustling ports. Here, Marco witnessed the vast maritime trade networks that connected islands like Java and Sumatra to the farthest reaches of the empire. He also experienced firsthand the complexity of the political and cultural landscapes of the Malay archipelago. In the courts of Southeast Asian kings, Marco Polo learned about their naval prowess, their agricultural techniques, and the exotic goods that flowed through their ports. From spices and precious woods to rare animals and silks, the kingdoms of Southeast Asia were key players in the global trade network Marco Polo was helping to build. In the lands of the South, I have seen riches beyond imagining. The people of Java and Sumatra live with the sea, and their ships sail farther than the eye can see. The spices they trade are unlike any I have ever known, fragrant and potent. They are worth more than gold in our land. As an envoy of Kublai Khan, Marco Polo didn't just serve in the northern and central part of the empire. His journeys took him far beyond, across oceans and through lands that were mysterious even to the Mongols. One of the most ambitious tasks he was given was to travel to the distant Indian subcontinent. During his time in India, Marco Polo was struck by the grandeur of the Indian subcontinent's kingdoms. From the wealth of the southern kingdoms to the religious diversity of the region, Marco was keen to absorb all that he could. His writings reflect the splendor of India's cities, the riches of its markets, and the strange customs he encountered. India, with its vast wealth and ancient traditions, was a place that deeply impressed Marco. He marveled at the splendor of the palaces, the complexity of the social systems, and the endless variety of goods that were traded from the Indian subcontinent. Marco had this to say about India. In the land of India, the cities are many and full of marvels. I have seen gold in abundance and heard tales of riches beyond measure. The temples are grand. Their spires rise like the mountains themselves, and the people are devout in their ways. It is a land of great mystery and wonder. By the late 1290s, Marco Polo had completed some of his longest and most ambitious diplomatic missions. He had traveled to the farthest reaches of the Mongol Empire and beyond, observing the intricate web of cultures, peoples, and trade networks that tied the world together. Now, as an older man, Marco found himself at the precipice of a new chapter. His time in the service of Kublai Khan had come to a close, and he was ready to return home to Venice. But his legacy, one of exploration, discovery, and cultural exchange, would endure for centuries to come. Marco Polo's endless journey had taken him to the ends of the known world. In the process, he became more than just a Venetian traveler. He became a symbol of the age of exploration. His name will be forever linked to the opening of East and West, and his stories would inspire countless generations to venture beyond the horizon. The world, as Marco Polo had come to understand it, was not just a collection of distant lands and strange people, but a vast, interconnected tapestry of cultures, ideas, and possibilities. After more than 2 decades in the service of Kublai Khan, Marco Polo finally began his journey back to Venice. It was a long and arduous return, crossing vast stretches of ocean and navigating through the many political and geographical challenges of the 13th century. For Marco, it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. By the time Marco Polo returned to his home city in 1295, he had seen and experienced more than most men could ever dream. His eyes had witnessed the grandeur of the Mongol Empire, the splendor of the East, and the diverse cultures that spanned from China to Persia. But the world he returned to in Venice was vastly different from the one he had left behind so many years earlier. Returning to Venice was not as Marco had imagined. The city had changed in his absence, and the life he once knew seemed distant and unfamiliar. For over 2 decades, Marco had been living in the Mongol Empire, a land of opulence, adventure, and mystery. Now, he found himself back in the heart of his homeland, where the familiar sights and sounds of Venice were a stark contrast to the exotic lands he had left behind. But Marco had returned not only as a traveler, but as a man with a vast fortune, a fortune he had acquired through his time in the service of Kublai Khan. It was this wealth that allowed him to reestablish himself in Venice and reintegrate into Venetian society. His family's mercantile business was revived, but Marco, now an older man, found that his time in the empire had left him with a different perspective on the world. Although Marco Polo was able to resume his life as a merchant, the return to normalcy was not without its challenges. Marco's wealth was significant, but it was the stories of his travels that captivated the people around him. Many of his fellow Venetians were fascinated by the tales of strange lands and incredible adventures, but not everyone believed him. In fact, some of Marco's friends and relatives doubted the veracity of his stories. How could a man from Venice have traveled so far, seen such wonders, and interacted with rulers like Kublai Khan? The skepticism he faced in his hometown would follow him throughout his life. Yet, Marco remained steadfast in his accounts, convinced that the truth of his journeys was undeniable. In 1298, a turning point in Marco Polo's life came when he was captured during a Venetian war against the rival city-state of Genoa. Marco Polo and his family were imprisoned by the Genoese, and it was during his time in captivity that he would begin the work that would immortalize his name, The Travels of Marco Polo. While in prison, Marco began dictating the story of his journeys to a fellow prisoner, Rusticolo de Pisa, a writer of romance tales. Over the course of many months, Marco recounted his travels to the east, his time at the court of Kublai Khan, the cities he had visited, the wonders he had witnessed, and the cultures he had encountered. I have seen more than any man could ever tell in a lifetime. I have traveled to lands where men live as we do, and to places where they live differently than we can imagine. I have seen cities filled with treasures, where the air smells of spices and the streets are alive with people from all over the world. Rusticolo, captivated by Marco's stories, took down everything he heard, weaving it into a narrative that would captivate readers for centuries. The Travels of Marco Polo would eventually be published in several languages, becoming one of the most important books of the medieval period. The result of their collaboration was a book that combined history, adventure, and fantasy. For many readers, it was a window into a world they had never known, a world filled with riches, strange customs, and exotic animals. But the book was also a reflection of Marco Polo's deep sense of wonder and curiosity about the world. He described cities with gold pavements, people with strange customs, and rulers who controlled vast empires that spanned continents. However, the accuracy of his stories would become the subject of debate. Many of his contemporaries and later historians questioned whether Marco Polo had truly seen all that he claimed to have witnessed. Some believed he had exaggerated or even fabricated parts of his travels. Others argued that his descriptions were based on second-hand accounts, passed on to him by those he met along the way. Despite the doubts surrounding the authenticity of his book, Marco Polo's travels remain one of the most widely read and influential works of the medieval period. It was a source of inspiration for future explorers, and it played a crucial role in sparking the age of exploration. Despite the skepticism he faced, Marco Polo's legacy was undeniable. His book opened up new worlds to the people of Europe, providing a glimpse into the cultures and lands of Asia. His descriptions of the wealth and power of the Mongol Empire inspired future explorers, including Christopher Columbus, who was said to have carried a copy of Marco's travels on his voyages across the Atlantic. For centuries, Marco Polo's name would be synonymous with adventure and discovery. Though much of his life remains shrouded in mystery, his journey continues to captivate the imagination of people around the world. The world he saw, the wonders of the Mongol Empire, the beauty of China, the grandeur of the Silk Road, was no longer a distant dream, but reality that inspired the explorers of tomorrow. As the years passed, Marco Polo grew older. The great adventurer who had once roamed the world's most distant corners was now a man at peace, content to reflect on the incredible life he had lived. His stories, whether wholly accurate or exaggerated, have become a part of the fabric of history, shaping how generations of people viewed the East and the larger world beyond their borders. Marco Polo passed away in 1324, and even in death, his legacy endured. His travels had opened new doors, not only for trade and diplomacy, but for the spirit of exploration itself. In a world that was once bounded by the known, Marco Polo's journeys showed that there was always more to discover, always more to learn. Marco Polo's story, with all its wonder, mystery, and debate, is ultimately the story of a man who sought to understand the world beyond the horizon. His travels, his writings, and his encounters with the Mongol Empire helped bridge two worlds that were once worlds apart. And though his tales may have been questioned, his place in history is secure as one of the greatest explorers the world has ever known. The exact last words of Marco Polo are not definitively known. However, there's a famous account of his last words that comes from a version of his deathbed story recounted by his family and later historians. According to one version, Marco Polo, when asked by his relatives whether he regretted his long years of travel and adventure, is said to have replied, "I have not told half of what I saw." With that, we will conclude this biography. But before I leave, I would like to thank you, the viewer. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. If there is any other historical figure you would like to see, please comment down below. And as always, thanks for watching. Rest easy.